Good evening, and welcome to the 2026 Durnbaugh Lecture at Elizabethtown College. Good evening, and welcome to the 2026 Durnbaugh Lecture here at Elizabethtown College. Delighted that each of you is here this evening with us. My name is Steve Nault, Director of the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies, the sponsor of the annual Durnbaugh Lecture, which honors the lives and work of Donald and Hedda Durnbaugh, towering figures in Brethren history, theology, hymnody, and bibliography. A couple who were instrumental in helping shape the Young Center in its earliest years in the 1980s and early 1990s. This evening, we are considering a topic that is one that is important to our speaker, Reverend Dr. Jeff Carter, on a number of levels. He has been a pastor in this area. Some of you know him from his time at Florin Church of the Brethren, also in Manassas, Virginia, at Manassas Church of the Brethren. He's worked at the Church of the Brethren Washington office on Capitol Hill through Brethren Volunteer Service, and now he is president of Bethany Theological Seminary and has been since 2013. He earned degrees from Bridgewater College, Bethany Theological Seminary, and Princeton Theological Seminary. He will be sharing with us this evening about the context for change and perhaps renewal in this moment of the church. It's no secret, Carter writes, that American religion is experiencing significant institutional change. That may be seen in some contexts in declining church membership and attendance, but it's broader than that, and it raises questions about the future of the institutional church. And yet, amid and alongside these sorts of changes, Carter has noted that young adults continue to develop and demonstrate sustained spiritual curiosity, but often outside traditional church structures. What does that mean? And what distinguishes our current moment from earlier periods of church history that were also marked by change and transition? And how might the faithful church engage contemporary culture in response to these trends and developments? So tonight we're privileged to have Jeff Carter with us to consider these questions. Tomorrow morning, he will be leading a discussion with pastors and audience members about what these questions mean in the lives of local congregations. But this evening, he's talking about setting the stage with some of the bigger picture of church and culture and change. Welcome.
Thank you, Steve, for that generous introduction. Good evening. It is wonderful to be back at Elizabethtown, a place that I once called home, and to be on the campus of Elizabethtown College with the Young Center. A special thanks to the Young Center and to Dr. Steve Nault for the invitation to be here with you this evening. It's also a deep honor to deliver the Durnbaugh Lecture. Dr. Don Durnbaugh, a longtime and respected faculty member at Bethany, was also my professor. I was a student in his class, the Believers Church, taught here at Elizabethtown at the Young Center. And Dr. Durnbaugh was brilliant. How many of you knew Don? Just absolutely brilliant. And I loved it when he used humor in class. With his dry wit, he would make a funny in the midst of his lecture, which none of us would get. And then Don would stop, he'd give a wry smile, chuckle, and then we would think back to the last thing he said, and then we'd say, oh, that was funny. That was funny. Of all his writings, and he was prolific as an author, of all his writings, the book that has meant the most to me is Pragmatic Prophet, the story of M.R. Ziegler. It had a profound impact on me when I read it. It sits next to two other books of profound impact on my shelf at the seminary. Bonhoeffer's Cost of Discipleship and Paul Tillich's Courage to Be. Books of great influence in my Christian walk and service. So, Dr. Durnbaugh was a professor at Bethany Theological Seminary. Just a note, I would not be the president of an institution if I did not make a comment about my institution. Bethany Theological Seminary is doing quite well. Mark Clapper is our board chair sitting here in front of me. Enrollment continues to grow with more than 120 students at the seminary. We're completing our second full year without a single student requesting a federal loan. We're about ready to unhook from the federal loan system. We will confer 40 certificates and degrees this spring between Nigeria and Richmond. It is the largest graduating class in the history of the Richmond campus at Bethany. We're concluding a $12 million capital campaign, and 12 was our goal, but we're going to take it to 15, and we hope to conclude that by the end of June. And you know that we recently received a $10 million grant from the Lilly Foundation, which is helping us fund new partnerships with the 6 Brethren-related colleges and universities. I want to thank President Ryder for her support in this partnership, for writing a letter of support, and for the growing support as our 2 institutions work together. We are celebrating 32 years in Richmond. That is it's an important mark. We were in the Oak Brook campus for 31 years. And so what was a very difficult decision to move the campus from Oak Brook to Richmond, one, some said, would end the seminary. We are 32 years in Richmond, and we are flourishing. So I appreciate your support. For tonight, let me say, Steve, I'm not a historian. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a cultural anthropologist. I am a theologian. And I'm a practical theologian at that. Some might say I'm an ecclesial oxymoron, a practical theologian. My purpose tonight is to invite you to join me in a process of discovery. For the last 30 years, I have wondered about 2 separate events in the 1990s and what has happened since to both the church and the wider American culture. My presentation is correlational, which means it's interpretive. I'll use typology, surveys, observations, and theories from social science to make meaning of what we, in the Church of the Brethren, a primarily white, older, mainline adjacent denomination, what we are experiencing today. I'm talking of the temporal realities of spiritual matters. I'm not talking about what God is or is not doing. Rather, the church's challenge of adaptation and response. My hope through this process is to understand the past, to make sense of the present, and to give some insight as to where we might be headed as a church and culture. But it's a bit of a guess. The title for the presentation, Church and Culture: A Shaking of the Foundations Again, incorporates 2 important ideas. First, Shaking of the Foundations was a book by theologian Paul Tillich. It's a collection of sermons from the mid-20th century. The central premise to this collection of sermons is that the foundations of human existence, our security, our culture, our social structures, are inherently insecure and prone to failing, and at a minimum, shaking. I use the term culture and not society, for society speaks to large structures, where culture is really about meaning making. Where society speaks to systems, culture speaks to knowing. This is an epistemological model, and at times it can be irrational. That, I think, is the frustrating part. But the question is, what does the world think? And what is it thinking right now? Similarly, religion is structured where spirituality is more fluid. Religion is communal. Spirituality is personal. Religion is outwardly ordered, where spirituality is inwardly focused. American religion, our structures are in crisis, while spirituality remains strong. So tonight, I will give a rather challenging interpretation of culture's impact on religion and the rise of spirituality. Tomorrow, my friends, Brian, Amy, Audrey, and Lexi, will help us make sense of it all. I'm not promising that tonight. They will, and with some hope and promise, send us in, hopefully, a wonderful direction. So, are you ready to begin? Come on, church, are you ready to begin? Got to remember, I'm a preacher at heart, right? So journey with me. This is a process of discovery. So in 1994, we had about 4,100 youth and advisors gathered together in Colorado State University for National Youth Conference, an event that happens every 4 years. 4,100 and some students and advisors. It was the largest NYC to date. Following that, Sean Replogle, who was the BVS coordinator for NYC, was invited by Judy Mills Reimer, so dropping some names, Judy Mills Reimer to speak at annual conference. And Sean, in that moment, was being lifted up as, here is the future leadership of the denomination. And in that sermon at annual conference, with all the enthusiasm around more than 4,000 youth and advisors at the previous NYC, Sean said, "Do not look at me. Look behind me at the great wave of young people that are coming. Don't look at me, but look at the wave of young people that are coming." In 1998, we had more than 4,500 youth and advisors at Colorado State for National Youth Conference. It would be the largest National Youth Conference on record, and that record holds today. Less than 30 years later, this year's National Youth Conference is expected to draw 700 youth and advisors. 500 have registered thus far. 1998, 4,100 and some change. Today, the hope is for 700. You think about the kids that were at that National Youth Conference in 1998, how old would they be today? They'd be in their early 40s, most likely married, possibly with children, families in the church. So what happened to them? The second curiosity from the 1990s. I pastored the Manassas Church of the Brethren. In 1995, when I shifted from Florence to Manassas, the church was booming. We had very little room in our sanctuary for new folks. We were beyond 80% full in our sanctuary. If you're 80% full, there's no room. And so we were at more than 80% full. And so the church decided to move into a more than $2 million building project, about $5.3 million today. We built a gymnasium, we doubled the size of our sanctuary, we added office space, class space, and we did work on the outside. We continued to grow then through the late 90s, opened the building in 98. The gym, the older folks called it the fellowship hall. The gym was incredibly popular, especially with the community, and we grew. And then we started to decline. Not by overall numbers, it was just that people weren't coming to church as often. And then the decline was felt, and today the Manassas Church of the Brethren is less than 100 on a Sunday morning. So what happened? Now, I'll add a third, just because Jeff Box here, and the third is Bethany. When did we move? It was in the mid-90s. The decision was made in the early 90s. We moved and started our work on campus 32 years ago. Why did we move? Because things in the church and in seminary education, and particularly the ministry, were all changing. If we had not moved, there might not be a Bethany today. So again, three things in the 90s. You know about the two fish, right? They're swimming around, and there's an older fish and a younger fish, and the older fish looks at the younger fish and says, "Hey, how's the water?" And the younger fish says, "What water?" So then what's happening in the water where we're swimming? Is it an issue of faith or with the church? Is the decline reversible, or are we looking at the end of the church, again, institution, as we have known it? I do not want to get into a theological debate about the word church, ecclesia, right? That is eternal and forever. But the institution church, is the decline reversible, or are we looking at the end of the church as we've known it? Now, the writings, you can go back as far as Robert Bellah in 1985, Habits of the Heart, where he talked about the rise of individualism. You can talk about Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone, where he said people are still bowling, but they're just not joining leagues, talking about the way we're disaffiliating. for this presentation, focusing on two resources. One, a book by Ted Smith, The End of Theological Education. As the president of a seminary, this book got my attention. The End of Theological Education. It's new, 2023, and Christian Smith's latest book. And you'll remember Christian Smith wrote previously about nuns and duns, right? Those who have no religious affiliation and those that are done. His latest book is Why Religion Went Obsolete: The Demise of Traditional Faith in America. So, changing dynamics. And this is the participatory part. How many of you still use this regularly, every day? I know, Paul Brubaker. But are you still communicating? What are you using? Yeah, the computer, right? How many of you still use this? Yeah, my mom has one in her basement, right, with the extra long cord so that you could walk around with it. What do? We still make phone calls, but how many of you have one of these? How many of you still use one of these? If you're probably 14 or younger, you have one. My kids have one. But you're still what? Taking pictures. But what are you using? Your phone or a digital camera. All right, Warren Eschbach, how many of you still use these? Yep, I knew it, Jeff Bach. Yep, listen to you and Bob Kettering. For the rest of us who are living in this decade, we are using what? Maybe Wikipedia, or think about AI, right? So what do these all four have in common? You said it, not me. So then what about this? And again, not the theological concept, but the institution. Pew Research, and this is the latest Pew Research, 2025. 16% of US adults said they were regularly attending religious services only in person and not online. 10% were regularly watching services only on screens, but not regularly going in person. 17% were regularly doing both. That means 43% total online and in person. These are the folks that are engaged in church. 33% in person. In 1960, it was 63%, but here's the catch. What does in person mean? Today, in person means once a month. In 1960, 3 or 4 times. My grandmother, if you were not in church 50 times a year, you were not a regular attender. But today, according to Pew, once a month makes you a regular attender. Another way of looking at it, so Pew Research, and the graph is the share of US adults identifying as Christian. Now, this is not attending. This is just identifying. And the good news in this is that it's leveled off. It's at about 63%. But if you go to the bottom line, you see the rise of the nones, those with no affiliation. So back to church statistics, 33% again go to church at least once a month. 8% of the American public go to church at least weekly. 8% are your weekly attenders. 43% of 18 to 24-year-olds versus 13% of 74 plus are religiously unaffiliated. So we're dealing with an issue that's more prevalent in the younger generations. Yet 86% of people believe people have a soul, and 83% believe in God. So it's about a 10-point drop for every generation, younger generation, in their strong or somewhat strong affiliation to church. So this is Pew language. So did they check the box, I have a strong or somewhat strong affiliation with church? And you can pick your generation, because the dates are there, but you'll see it's a 10% drop as you go generation to generation. So you look at my kids, and they are at less than 20% of my kids' generation would say there is a strong or somewhat strong affiliation. Again, this is not about church attendance, but this is just about identity. One of the challenges is that we have a lack of generational replacement. And Gen Alpha, they have millennial parents. So what does that mean, typically? So to get to the word obsolete, this is a quote out of Christian Smith's book. It's unplanned obsolescence. Something becomes obsolete when most people feel it is no longer useful or needed because something else has superseded it in function, efficiency, value, or interest. Why do we not use Kodak film anymore? Is because there's other ways of taking pictures. Yeah. So I'm going to lean heavy on the work of Ted Smith, Associate Dean at Candler Theological Seminary in Atlanta, in his book, The End of Theological Education. Ted Smith provides three dominant social imaginaries, ways of thinking about the church and the world, and this is historical. So standing orders from about 1500 to early 1700, voluntary associations from the early 1700s to the 1960s, and he uses the word individualization, the creation of the individual, not just being an individual, from the 1960s to the present. And you'll see that there aren't clean lines between these. And I'll give an example in just a moment. So the standing order, early part of American history. Core institutions of the standing order, the church as established. Think about England, the Church of England. Who's the head of the Church of England? The king, right? It's established. So the core institution of the standing order is the church is established. The congregation is a parish. The reason the Manassas and the Nokesville churches in Northern Virginia were established is because the parish of Midland was too far away for a horse to get to Manassas, right? Territorial parishes. Ministry is an office because theological education was part of classical education and did not differentiate between service of church and state. And here's a great example, John Winthrop. John Winthrop, Puritan, the Sermon City on a Hill, right? The Puritan colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he was governor, but he was also preacher. Established, Puritan, as a colony. His education, Trinity College, Cambridge. He was trained in the classics of theological education as he was being trained as a student. They weren't differentiated. Why did the standing order come unraveled? Well, the rise of individualism in American Protestantism, and it's part of the American experiment. Commercial markets expanded, migration enhanced pluralism, revivals increased participation, but dissolved the establishment. Different regions and a large frontier made any federal establishment impossible. We see this actually in the Church of the Brethren. That's why all our districts are so different. It's hard to have a denominational identity when contextually we are so different in West Virginia and Pennsylvania and California and Kansas. That's why we struggle, right, with a common identity. Well, this was the challenge to the standing order. But there's remnants of the standing order today. We've had In God We Trust on our money since 1864, but it was Eisenhower on July 30th, 1956, who changed the nation's motto from E pluribus unum to In God We Trust. Eisenhower and Reagan both sought to reframe the U.S. as a Christian nation. And you could say, going back to the Founding Fathers, but how were the Founding Fathers educated? So both Eisenhower and Reagan sought to reframe the U.S. as a Christian nation. On May 17th, this May, that is the day to be when the U.S. will be rededicated as a nation of God under President Trump. Sound familiar? Remnants of the standing order. The rise of voluntary associations from 1700 to about 1960. So what happened after the standing order started to decay? And these aren't straight lines. It doesn't happen in a day, right? They kind of bleed over one another. But it went from the assumed establishment to denominations. Congregations went from village parishes, churches, to voluntary societies, meaning I don't want to go to the church closest to me. I want to go to the church down the road or in the next town, right? It was about individualism and choice. Ministry went from an office to a profession. Theological education went from reading classics to professional education for pastors. Is this starting to sound familiar? How many of you had to take a religion class when you were in college? Or better yet, chapel was mandatory. It was at Bridgewater. I think of Harry Emerson Fosdick, right? Great preacher. Riverside was his congregation in New York. He was ordained Baptist, right? Establishment wasn't universal, but it was contextual. He was a pastor. That was his office. And he went to Union Theological Seminary to be trained as a pastor. It's very specific. It's interesting when you look at the establishment of the professional model for theological education, you can see this track that the brethren fall right into, a track, not a trap, right? A track. The first seminary was Andover Theological Seminary, founded in 1807 in Boston. Do you know where Andover Newton is today? The oldest theological school in the U.S. It is an office at Yale, and they sold their campus. When that happened, all of us in theological education shuddered. The oldest theological school in America. Yale Divinity was 1822, and then interesting enough, when you go back, think back to the 1950s. I can think back, some of you were there. Think back to the 1950s. You know, if your child is a doctor, a lawyer, a preacher, those three kind of ran together. Interesting, 1822 was Yale. Then in 1847, the American Medical Association was founded. Then Howard University Divinity School, 1870, African American. University of Chicago Div in 1891. And then the Association of the American Law Schools founded. Those three running together, professions. Let's professionalize law, medicine, and clergy. Bethany Bible School in 1905, and then the predecessor to ATS, the Association of Theological Schools, my accreditor, was founded in 1918. Interesting, all these schools start, and then you have accreditation. Church of the Brethren Higher Ed follows a similar path. And John Dewey, the educator, I think was influential in the change of education from the focus on the learned to the learner. So it moved from the disposition of facts, so you open up someone's head and dump in, to the formation of the individual. And Brethren Higher Ed, this is, with every school, this is part of the motto. Here we educate for service, right? It's a part of all the Brethren schools. So Manchester, 1860, Juniata, 1876, Bridgewater, Hail Alma Mater, 1880, McPherson, 1887, 1891 was University of Laverne, 1899, Elizabethtown College, and then right there, 1905, Bethany Theological Seminary. You see how education is working within the voluntary societies and this professionalization of ministry. For Bethany, pastors need specialized training. You particularly found this with Bowman, President Bowman, because the church was growing. And for the Church of the Brethren, we grew until about 1963, 64. So you see Bethany Bible School established in 1905. We were on Hastings Street in 1905, and then the Van Buren campus in 1909. Anyone visited the Van Buren campus? Yeah, Teresa? Then we moved the school was renamed Bethany Biblical Seminary in 1931, and I find the name changes interesting because it tracks with the changes that are happening with professionalized ministry. And then Bethany Theological Seminary was renamed, and it moved in 1963, Oak Brook 63, and then Richmond in 94. So you see this similar tracking happening at Bethany as happened in theological education, as happened in higher ed, and it matches the time. It does not surprise me that we moved to Oak Brook, which was to be the great, big, wonderful campus, in 1963, as the Church of the Brethren was hitting their statistical high as far as attendance. Smith notes that the voluntary associations have proven remarkably durable. So you think about racial caste, new immigrant communities, new religious movements, religions beyond Christianity. The organizations in which people gathered were very flexible. And I think of my dad talking about Vietnam and coming back from Vietnam. He was in the Army. And he said, in the Army, right, there was desegregation because of just the atmosphere of war. And then coming back, that led back into some of the organizations like VFW and such. And so these voluntary associations were rather pliable in kind of accepting how culture was changing. But what was known is now facing decline, if not crisis. Church's denomination, we are living in a post-denominational world. Congregation is voluntary society. Church attendance is on the decline. Ministry as profession. Much of our growth at the seminary, we've doubled in size in the last 10 years. It's not in the MDiv. It's not individuals preparing for ministry. Theological education as professional education, particularly in the Church of the Brethren, Audrey will tell you, is on the decline. We have to figure out new ways. So then that leads us to the rise of the nuns from 1960s to today. So church membership among U.S. adults is now below 50%. And remember, we're not talking about 1960s membership, my grandmother's membership where you're there all the time. This is about membership where you might attend, right? This is about affiliation. It's down to 47%. This is a chaotic slide, but it's really important for a couple of reasons, most of them about perception. So the one arrow on the left, the little orange arrow, is when the rise of evangelicals surpassed the decline of the mainline churches. So when I use the term evangelical church, I'm talking about a church that has an emphasis on personal salvation, scriptural inerrancy, evangelism, and tends to be more socially conservative. Mainline and Brethren have always been mainline adjacent. I won't say always. I'll let Jeff Bach say when that happened. But we've been mainline adjacent at least through the 20th century into this century. To be mainline is to be socially progressive, a focus on social justice, scripture as interpretive, maybe metaphor, and a focus on inclusivity. The Church of the Brethren 1979 paper on biblical inspiration and authority is a clear sign and symbol of this division. The evangelical church surpassed the mainline church in the mid-'80s, about 1985. And if you were part of the church, as I was during that era, you might remember some of the conversations. If you go to the far right and see the arrow that is horizontal, that is the line where nuns then surpassed any other category as the most numerous category related to religion. Larger than evangelicals, Catholics, mainline, Black Protestant, other faith, or Jewish, where nuns are now the largest group in America. And you'll see that evangelicals since the mid-1990s have also been in decline. An evangelical denomination would be the Southern Baptist or the Assembly of God. Mainline Protestant would be Methodist, Presbyterians. I find this graph fascinating. Partly because I think if you would ask most folks in even 10 years ago, who holds the primary voice of religion in America, they would say the mainlines. But it hasn't been. It's been the evangelical voice, which has held the primary voice for a lot longer than I think people realize. What's happening? There's a lack of generational replacement. That's the 10 points. Decline in stigma for not affiliating. Boy, there was a time if my grandmother saw someone mowing their grass as she was coming back from church. Nope, right? But now, you don't go to church, there's no stigma. There are some that are turned off by politics, others that are turned on by real politics. These are the politics that engage folks. In the Church of the Brethren for right now, it's about deportation. That is energizing individuals that are conservative and liberal, right? That's real politics. It's interesting that David Hollinger, Brethren sociologist, in his book, Beyond Cloven Tongues of Fire, says that we lost a lot of members in the Church of the Brethren in the late 60s, early 70s, because politics was moving on issues of race where the church wasn't. So with the, was it 1964, the Civil Rights Act, there was great political movement on issues of race, but not from the church. And so folks abandoned the church and went to the political movements. And that's Hollinger in Beyond Cloven Tongues of Fire. Some would say church teachings are too exclusive. Some say they're watered down. This is the gotcha right now. That if you start looking at Barna and Pew and other research tools, some will say they're too political. And then others will say, but they don't say anything. And it's back and forth. And so it really is a darned if you do, darned if you don't. There's no clear line. The sexual abuse by clergy definitely has created decline within the church because it's about trustworthiness and integrity. And then the youth sports industrial complex. I stay out at Spooky Nook. That's right, Spooky Nook, right? And lots of times I can't get a room at the Hampton Inn there because it's taken up by volleyball players. The youth sports industrial complex. So what's not happening? And I think this is important. Secularization is not happening. 90% of Americans hold some spiritual beliefs. For Pew, active rejection or disbelief leads to secularization, not unbelief or disaffiliation. That's an important kind of distinguishing comment. People can just become meh about religion, and that's not secularization. Secularization is actually active rejection and disbelief for Pew. So the majority of Americans still hold some spiritual belief. And this comes out in surveys. Most nuns believe in God or a higher power, but not in a biblical God. So if you look, religious nuns, both the dark blue and the light blue, you've got 69% of nuns believe in God or some kind of higher power. It's interesting, among religiously affiliated, it's not 100%. 90%, that's the bottom slide, 90% seldom or never attend services, meaning the religious nuns. So this is, I talked to Dr. Ryder about this as we were talking about the partnership. These are the spiritually curious, but they're just not connected. Almost half of nuns think of themselves as spiritual. But 54% of nuns engage in some, and 54% of nuns engage in some kind of spiritual practice. So here's where it gets dicey for good church people. Because we would say a spiritual practice is going to church, Bible study, prayer, but spirituality itself is being broadened beyond traditional lines. So spend time centering the self, spend time in nature, meditate, exercise, practice yoga. Those are all considered spiritual acts. Why? Because it takes yourself outside of yourself in reflection to come back to yourself. And that's kind of that spirituality loop. And so folks will say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. So what's happening? And we're in this liminal in-between space. Voluntary associations of every kind are struggling. You go to the Kiwanis, the Masons, the Lions, the VFW, you name your crowd, and most likely it is an older crowd and it's declining. And religious beliefs, practices, and desires are moving beyond the bounds of voluntary associations. So I'll go out in nature and be with God rather than to be in church on a Sunday morning. Why is it happening? It's less of a decline in spiritual belief and practice, more a process of individualization, a change in the relationship of individuals to institutions. And I use the word, and Ted Smith used the word individualization because it's about the creation of the individual. So individualization, and I add or authenticity. I don't think they're the same, but I often hear from folks that might live in my own house, I am being my authentic self. Individualization or authenticity. This is an entangled mix of cultural mindset, economic, political, and social currents. So this idea of individualization, I wish there was just one line that we could draw and say, this is what's happening. But it's this mix, this broad mix. But it's not personal moral failing. Again, I loved my grandmother. I did. But my grandmother, moral failing if you're not going to church, right? And I think that's probably an old message that is true. In this case, it's not. So I'm going to weave together a couple of threads. And my hope is, as I kind of talk about each one, you'll say, oh, yeah, I see this, either in my community or on the news or with the people I'm in conversation. But I'm going to put together a couple of threads. The first one is a cultural mindset. Cultural mindset, two streams came together in the late part of the 20th century that are impacting us now. One is postmodernism, the other one is social constructivism. Postmodernism basically says there is no grand narrative. In modernity, through most of the 20th century, there was these themes that we could pull out and say there are these grand narratives, there are these themes. With postmodernity, there's no single theme. There's no single reality that exists that human can correctly understand. All of life is interpreted. Therefore, authorities, experts, and others with power should be critiqued and resisted. Science is not science. It's all a matter of interpretation. All knowledge is relativized by its place in culture, history, and social location. Does that sound familiar? There is no universal truth. As Gen Xers would say, well, you do you. You do you. Social constructivism is all identities and meanings are unstable. They're multiple and fluid. They're bound by context and cultural understanding. They're transmitted from one generation to another generation as factual truth, and yet they're interpreted. From defining beauty, what is beauty? Well, define it today and then define it 25 years ago and then maybe 50 years ago, and I think you'd get some different answers. Or even the value of money. Fluid, changing. Think about gender. Think about race. Social constructivism says that all identities and meanings are unstable. And postmodernism, there's no grand narrative. Where does this lead? It leads to relativism. Gen Xers would say, you do you. It's your experience. But people are also seeking meaning and meaning making without a grand narrative. So where do they immediately go? If there's no grand narrative to orient them, they head to the next greatest source. It lends itself to self-creation. So that's the first thread. And do you see it? The second is economics. So after the stock market crash, and in the 1930s, the government, because of the crash and the instability and the Great Depression, the government took a more active role in the economy. It's called Keynesian economics. And with Keynesian economics, it's focused on the government as a protector of stability and active in providing market control. It worked great for about 50 years until the 1980s, and we had stagflation. Now, Keynesian economics, you may want to remember, it's built on collaboration, it's built on the common good, it's built on care and sharing. After stagflation in the 80s, we got neoliberal capitalism. Neoliberal capitalism is, well, it lives in a competitive global economy focused on privatization, deregulation, and monetized spending. The market is not manipulated for stability as it was in Keynesian economics, but rather for growth. How do we manipulate the market for its greatest growth? Neoliberal capitalism raised the bar for what it took to sustain a successful career in the 1990s and beyond. This is the era that I entered into. I was born in 1970, I'm 55. So when we talk about the 1990s, this is when I stepped into, at least I think I stepped into adulthood. The consequence for religion was that younger Gen Xers and millennials had to invest far more time in the 90s and following, far more time and attention and energy and emotion into preparing for launching and developing what they'd hoped would be a successful career. Right? The right education, the right background, the right school. Focus on careers, delayed marriage, and the beginning of families. Individuals were about 8 years older than they were 20 years before when getting married and having kids. And because they were older, they'd already established patterns when those kids came along, so they didn't feel as compelled to get back to church as previous generations. So there was a lack of return to church. It's also important to note that the birth rate is down 25% in the last 20 years, since 2007. There's a rise of unmarried couples. The stigma of living together is no longer, and there is a rebuff to all the purity laws of the 1990s. Therefore, many young people just choose not to get married. This created a more mobile workforce, both on the first job and the second job. And with every time a person moves, it lessens the retention rate for a church. Because if someone moves and moves to a new community, they're less likely, by percentage, to engage in a new church, particularly if they know they have to move again. It also created a more mobile workforce, a need for greater education in technical fields, and less time for religion. The challenge is it defines humans as fundamentally satisfaction-seeking consumers, seeking acquired objects and experiences, looking always for continual improvement. Christian Smith will say 1991. And why 1991? It was the rise of hyper-consumerism. Have you ever been to Costco, where you can buy in bulk? That is a new and modern phenomenon. And if you're like me and enjoy a game of golf in Northern Virginia, you get to see a lot of backyards, and most of the backyards are there because of Costco and the competition to keep up and to be better and to add. What are we worried about? Consumption. And if consumption is not there, then what happens to the economy? It falters. This shift from values of mutuality, care, and common life to competition, attainment, and personal wealth and security is part of a yo-yo economy. You know what yo-yo means? You are on your own, right? You're on your own. It's a yo-yo economy from the spirit of mutuality that was built up through FDR and Eisenhower. So it's another theme. A third is politics. I love this quote from James Dobson: "The side that wins gains the right to teach what it believes to its children." Didn't say I agree with it, but I do love it because it's true, at least how we see it play out now. In the Scopes monkey trial in 1925, it highlighted, and that was the battle over evolution and creation, it highlighted rural, literalist Christian views against urban secular influence. After that, the fundamentalists kind of retreated into a more insular circle, building separate institutions and kind of really bearing down on identity and ideology. Post-war, you saw the rise of Billy Graham and Charles Fuller and Carl Henry. They were all neo-evangelicals, and they sought to kind of shed the trappings of fundamentalism and to be more engaged in the culture. And you'll remember through Billy Graham, he'd have these great revivals, and often he would have pop stars there, well-known folks, and as folks came forward to be converted or saved, he would then hand them off to another pastor of a church so they could be discipled. And that was the way Billy Graham operated. Keep that in mind. So neo-evangelicals with public revivals and connections to pop stars and political figures also sought to have a greater influence in the community, the wider community and culture. So they went to radio. Why radio and then television? Because the main lines already controlled the pew, but they didn't control the airways. And so the new evangelical movement went to the airways and went to television. In the 1940s, the Charles and Grace Fuller's old-fashioned revival hour had more listeners than Jack Benny on network. I found that interesting, just like you, Jeff. 1970s to the 1990s, there was an amazing resurgence of religion in public and political life and the resurgence of the evangelical movement. You know the names: Oral Roberts, Pat Robertson, and Jim Baker. They built huge television followings, right? Radio and television, huge television followings. Throughout the 50s and 60s, Protestants held the pews, main lines, evangelicals the airways. The rise of the televangelists in the 70s and 80s gave a perfect avenue for cultural influence by the likes of Roberts, Swaggart, Baker, Schuller, Falwell, and Robertson. And they leveraged that. So in the 1980s, the Christian right leveraged their well-established presence on radio and television, especially Christian Broadcast Network on cable, to influence more people in the pews. And mind you, what was happening to the mainline churches at this time? They were declining. In 1979, in Lynchburg, Virginia, Jerry Falwell and others founded the Moral Majority, set to mobilize conservative Christians as a political force to save a nation in decay. It was the birth of the Christian right. Mid-1980s saw evangelicals outnumber mainline Protestants. In the 90s, evangelicalism raced to be the most prominent Christian voice and the most prominent Christian political voice, with the Moral Majority, Christian Coalition, and Focus on the Families. These groups supported political groups such as Newt Gingrich's Contract with America. I saw Newt Gingrich most mornings as I was leaving the Washington office or coming in, because his apartment was right next to us. So I had a front row seat to this happening. These groups, the Moral Majority, the Christian right, influenced Newt Gingrich's Contract with America, leading to the Tea Party, forming the foundation of Make America Great Again. And all three political movements share a strong relationship between Republicans and the Christian right. From a relationship between the Christian right and the Republican Party to a bridge between politics and faith, composed mostly of white evangelical Christians, to a core identity marker of today's Republican Party, it's best represented as we see it in Christian nationalism. Two big changes that come out of this narrative. The first is that act of Billy Graham taking someone and connecting them with the church stopped with television. The connection was just made with the screen. And so you begin to get the idea of, well, it's just Jesus and me. It's Jesus and me. It's not a church. It's not an intermarry. It's Jesus and me. The second is that politics got entwined with Christianity, supporting views that younger Americans saw as inconsequential over time, like evolution and creation, biblical lyricism, social concerns such as abortion and gay marriage, and the Gen X response. In all of this, you do you. Live and let live. You do you. Two moves with the rise of evangelicalism. Not saying it's good or bad, but saying the impact on the culture today, it is about Jesus and me and the connection between politics and religion. And so the James Dobson quote, "He who wins teaches the children." And then social media. We all know about social media. The challenge is people will go to social media first and say social media is the problem, but ignoring all these other threads that are impacting our day-to-day. And when we can see and hear all of those threads very present, from the news to conversations with neighbors. So social media undercuts religion in a number of ways. One, it just takes a lot of time, right? It takes an awful lot of time. There was a day where we thought it was crazy for someone to spend an hour on email. There's a new way of finding community without leaving your house. You can find the dark side of religion. It's exposed, and communities circle around the dark side of religion. There's shorter attention spans, and truth is, it's incoherent. There's so many feeds that truth itself becomes incoherent. So not only are we lacking a grand narrative, but as people seek then to build the self, that self itself is incoherent. It makes oneself the final arbiter of truth, which goes back to postmodernism and social constructivism. You can't tell me. I know. The interesting thing is the impact on faith formation. So in the standing order, the church's influence and the role of education was how people were formed in their faith. With voluntary association, it was really the preacher's influence in what individuals heard on a Sunday to Sunday. And I know in the Church of the Brethren, the priesthood of all believers, but the preacher makes a difference, because that's how we're formed by Scripture. If you read Martin Marty, historian, would say that we treat the Bible as an icon, that we revere it, that we hold it on high, but as a public, we really don't engage it. So 80% of Americans will say the Bible is really important, but only 20% engage it, right? So there's this gap. So the preacher becomes important. The preacher is the one during voluntary association, and why my grandmother would always pick the church with the best looking preacher, right? The preacher mattered, right? And that was the choice. And then you get to individualization, where culture's influence and the role of the media is what forms faith. And we see that most recently in social media, right? In the debates. So then what about this? What's happening? It's interesting right now in churches that individuals are kind of gravitating in two directions. Churches are getting bigger or they're getting smaller. We've always been at the midpoint. I think Carl Bowman at one point said, like, the average Church of the Brethren congregation, and this would have been a number of years ago, was like 130, 150. Those churches, they're either getting smaller or you're seeing other churches grouped together getting larger. So shifts in congregational size. Most congregations are small. Median size, 50. Before COVID, it was 65. Most members are in a few large congregations. It's a competition for the few. I was at a meeting with Brian Messler in Florida, and there were 10 churches, some of the largest churches in our denomination, and it represented, 10% of the Sunday morning attendance in those churches for the Church of the Brethren. 10% of Sunday morning attendance is seen in those 10 churches, right? So we see it in our own denomination. With changes in size comes changes in institutional ethos. House churches and mega churches both tend to be less like voluntary societies. Large congregations transition from volunteers to staff. Members work less for the institution, more on themselves. Small congregations, deprofessionalization of clergy and de-emphasis on programming reduces overhead. More like kinship networks, right? We take care of ourselves. Both ask members for less institutional maintenance, direct service, inward or outward. We have seen this particularly post-COVID. The whole quiet quitting phenomena of folks just backing off of their involvement, whether it's in the workplace or volunteerism. And this is the work of Ted Smith, where churches are either getting bigger, because then you got a staff to do it, or getting smaller, because you don't have to do VBS. And in the middle, what happens? Those churches begin to fold. So we live with multiple realities. Some religious institutions who have the mission and resources will continue for a while, for maybe a long while. Other religious institutions will one day merge or close. What was fascinating in this meeting that Brian and I attended is that one church that's rather large now is actually a combination of a number of small churches, that the small churches couldn't do the things they wanted, and so they all collapsed together under the Church of the Brethren in that particular town, right? So moves, mergers, and closings. It's what seminaries are going through right now. So other religious institutions will one day merge or close. And other religious institutions will make radical change in what they are doing. So we're radical pietists. I'll go back to Durnbaugh, right? He was the one that really kind of stoked that debate. Do the brethren lean more to Anabaptism or radical pietism? Our radical pietism is about belief. It's not about our rate of change, right? Like any institution, we have a hard time with change. And yet, this is the question: what does change look like? And it will be change of our creation or creation of change that will be placed upon us. So there are some things that I wonder about. What ifs? And we can, for those who are around, we can talk about this tomorrow. What if we shift from a denominational mindset to the mindset that we had in 1708, and that we're a movement. This fits both the Anabaptist and the radical Pietist side, that we're a movement. What if we take the shift from denomination to a movement? What if we emphasize Christian spirituality and practice over polity and structure? I don't know if you've been to an annual conference, but we talk an awful lot about polity and structure. And if you want to know more, we can form a committee and talk about it. What if we define church as a community who worships, serves, and lives the red letters? You know the red letters, right? That old King James, the words of Jesus. For us, if you talk about the marks of our tradition in the Church of the Brethren, we have a hermeneutical focus, an interpretive focus on Jesus. Right? We take all of Scripture, but we narrow to the New Testament, to the Gospels, to the Sermon on the Mount, to the words of Jesus. What if we just make things a little more simple? What if we forego the culture wars and strive for authenticity through self-differentiation? Particularly if you go back to the standing order, what was one of the pieces that cut at the standing order? It was that we were so diverse in different places. So what if you have a common identity through your faith, but the expressions then are more nimble due to your context? And foregoing debates and thinking about authenticity, as I would think about authenticity. What if we lean into meaning making through narrative? Story. Not a grand narrative, but a narrative that is contextual. So let me share a little bit about how we are thinking at the seminary, at Bethany. First, and I'll give you 3 examples, we no longer use strategic planning in the way strategic planning is most thought of. It used to be where you'd sit around and say, who are we going to be in 5 years? And then you get together and you kind of write it out and say, we're going to start marching to that. And you give different indicators of how you're going to be in 5 years, and you start moving in that direction. We realized early on that the future was just too open, that we couldn't throw a dart out there 5 years and say, this is who we're going to be and what we're going to do. And so we went to an emergent planning process, and basically it's about asking really good questions. We ask ourselves continually, ad nauseum, 4 questions. An education for whom and for what? For what shall we be known? What is our relationship with the Church of the Brethren? How do we maintain sustainability? Both Audrey and Mark know these questions well, having served the board. We ask them again and again, and Paul, and again, these questions, and it allows us to be nimble. Then we make a decision, and then we act on that decision. Often that decision gives us something that we knew was there as a possible next decision, but then also 2 opportunities that we didn't know were there. And it may be a community or a program, and so therefore we maybe go in the way we knew or know that was there, or we move in a new direction. And then we ask the questions again from that vantage point. And then we ask them again and again. So our board next weekend will receive a strategic vision based on these 4 questions with goals and priorities for the next 2 or 3 years. But they're not set in stone because something might happen, like COVID, where you have to ask the questions again and reorder your priorities. What this creates is opportunity. I believe there is a ton of opportunity before us if we go back to the what ifs. And it would take the what ifs to then see the opportunity. What if we engage someone in Christian ministry, but they don't come to church? What would that look like? There might be an opportunity there, right? So the opportunity, emergent planning, I would call this Holy Spirit planning, if I get theological. I would call it Holy Spirit planning rather than the Promised Land planning. Promised Land, you know where you're going, even if it's going to take you 40 years, right? But you're going to get there. The Spirit planning is more like Pentecost, right? Where you're open and you're going to do the next best thing in the most faithful way possible. And the nice thing is you haven't taken a huge step. So if you make a mistake, you just walk backwards. Where has that led us? Expanded program, which has meant growth. We've doubled the size of the seminary in the last 10 years, more than 120 students. We've moved from being 80% brethren to 80% ecumenical without changing the number of brethren students we have. So we have the same number of brethren students, but we've just grown in other ways. So this is from left to right. This is off a dashboard. You don't have to read it all. If you think about programs, when I started, we had 1 certificate and 2 master's degrees. Today, we have 5 master's degrees and 9 certificates, and the faculty are always designing new certificates. So as you look at the growth from left to right, the bar gets more and more colorful as you go along. That is the development and creativity of new programs and moving things more and more online so that accessibility is there for all individuals. So those are our big pieces: accessibility, affordability, and the student experience. But expanded program meant thinking about seminary in a new and creative way, which leads us to Elizabethtown College. So the UP program, this is really, really creative. And you know what UP stands for? Undergraduate program. Our dean came up with that. And if you know Steve, it makes perfect sense. He was like, let's just call it UP. It's the undergraduate program, branded with Bethany colors. And so doing this work and these curiosities, I mean, the curiosities from the 90s have just sat with me through all these years of wanting to understand what is happening and making a decision to act before having all the answers. And I think that's part of the challenge is we don't have all the answers, and yet we've got to do something. And so seeing that we have this large group of spiritually curious young adults that are in our colleges, whether they're Church of the Brethren or not, they're spiritually curious, but they're not in church. And then you wonder, where are they getting their spiritual formation? Where are they testing their questions? What are they wondering about? So seeing that and knowing that colleges often need to have a program that's larger than their institution as they attract students, and that finances are often an issue, and that they want to keep the students on campus. So having students leave Elizabethtown College and come mid-year to Bethany is not going to work. Because of all of our development technology, it was easy. Went to the college and said, can we partner in offering your students theological education, and you keep your students on campus, and they can get a certificate while they matriculate through your educational curriculum. And when they graduate, they'll have maybe a certificate and a degree, and then hopefully they'll come to Bethany. We know 53% of our students who attain 1 certificate or degree often go on for a second. So we're playing the long game here. But for me personally, I have kids this age. I want them to have someone that is ready and prepared and wanting to have conversations about matters that are beyond this moment. And so Dr. Ryder and the other college presidents, all without a moment of hesitation, said, we're in. And so right now at Bethany, we have students from Manchester University and McPherson enrolled in classes. We hope that Juniata and E-Town will be joining us soon, and then University of Laverne and Bridgewater. It's being staggered because we're learning as we're going along. It goes back to that emergent process, right? What's working and what's not? How do we need to make changes? But this idea of, well, the students aren't coming to the seminary. No, we're going to go to the students. And it just might be that there is a student that will be curious enough to get a certificate and then may see that their passion and ministry connect, and they live it out in some way that has greater meaning for their lives. Or that you have someone going through a professional program and they have a deeper understanding of spiritual matters and ethics, right? It's a win-win-win-win. But again, it's not sitting and asking students or even praying for them to come. It's about changing the way we see our work, because they're there. I wonder what that means for the church, because they're there. Love this quote from James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Tomorrow, we're going to have a conversation with 4 of my friends about what's happening in their ministry settings. Take a kind of on the ground view, some reflection on this presentation, but my hope is to hear what is working and what is not, and how we are working in new ways. Because something's happening. Amen? So my question to you, so how's the water?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that presentation. And I hope that excites all of you to return tomorrow morning, whether you were planning to or not. The Durnbaugh Seminar, you can plan to now. The Durnbaugh Seminar will convene at 9:30 tomorrow morning, not in this space where you are right now, but at the Young Center across campus. If you have not been to the Young Center, you can use the address 450 Campus Road in your navigation app. But 450 Campus Road, Elizabethtown, is the entrance to our parking lot on the other side of campus. We're a single-story limestone building, and there's ample parking right there at the Young Center. So we'll be there from, the seminar will convene at 9:30. We'll go for about an hour and take a break, and then another hour. And as Jeff said, this will be a discussion with 4 pastors: Brian Mesler, lead pastor of Ephrata Church of the Brethren; Amy Shorner Johnson, chaplain and director of spiritual and religious life here at Elizabethtown College; Lexi Alagarbus, co-pastor of Harrisburg First Church of the Brethren; and Audrey Hollenberg Duffy, pastor of discipleship ministries at Oakton Church of the Brethren in Vienna, Virginia, and director of the Susquehanna Valley Ministry Center. So they will be discussing all of the themes and developments that we've been introduced to this evening, what that means for the congregations and the young people in their lives and circles. And then we'll also, everyone who's there will engage in conversation and discussion around these themes. So please return tomorrow morning at 9:30 for the Durnbaugh Seminar. Thank you for being here this evening. Thank you for your support of the Young Center, and safe travels as you return home this evening.